There's a moment that comes for all of us, a moment where everything we've prepared for, everything we've trained ourselves to do, suddenly evaporates into thin air. You've been there before. Maybe it was standing in front of a room full of people, your presentation notes trembling in your hands, and despite rehearsing your speech 100 times, your mind goes completely blank. Or perhaps it was that critical job interview, the one that could have changed everything, where you found yourself stumbling over the simplest questions, watching your confidence drain away with every passing second. It could have been a high-stakes conversation with someone you love, where you knew exactly what you wanted to say, had the words perfectly formed in your mind. And yet when the moment arrived, something inside you shut down, and all those carefully crafted sentences dissolved into uncomfortable silence. These aren't just bad days or unfortunate coincidences. These are the moments when your own mind, the very instrument you depend on to navigate the world, turns against you with surgical precision. And here's what makes it so devastating. You know you're capable. Deep down, you know you have the skills, the knowledge, the talent to succeed in these moments. When you're alone, when the pressure is off, you perform beautifully. You can think clearly, speak eloquently, make decisions with confidence and precision. But the instant the stakes rise, the instant something truly matters, it's as if someone flips a switch inside your brain, and suddenly you're not yourself anymore. You become a stranger to your own abilities, watching helplessly as your mind sabotages everything you've worked for. And the cruelest part? You can feel it happening in real time. You're aware of the betrayal as it unfolds, but you're powerless to stop it. It's like being a passenger in your own body, screaming at the driver to slow down, to turn around, to stop heading toward disaster. But the driver can't hear you, won't hear you, and keeps accelerating toward the crash you can see coming from miles away. Most people think this is about nerves, about anxiety, about not being mentally tough enough. They tell themselves they just need to relax, to breathe, to think positive thoughts, as if the solution to a biological warfare happening inside their skull is simply to smile more and believe in themselves. But that's not what's happening here. This isn't a character flaw or a weakness you need to overcome through willpower alone. What's happening in these high-pressure moments is far more complex, far more primal, and far more insidious than simple nervousness. Your mind isn't randomly malfunctioning. It's executing an ancient survival program that was designed millions of years ago to keep your ancestors alive in a world full of physical threats. A program that has no idea how to distinguish between a charging predator and a quarterly sales meeting. And because this program runs at a level far below your conscious awareness, far below the part of you that can think rationally and make deliberate choices, it hijacks your entire system before you even realize what's happening. Let me take you inside what's actually occurring in your brain during these moments. Because once you understand the machinery of self-sabotage, you can finally begin to dismantle it. Imagine your brain as a complex city with different districts, each responsible for different functions. In the front of this city, you have the prefrontal cortex, the newest and most sophisticated neighborhood, where all your higher thinking happens. This is where you plan, where you analyze, where you make rational decisions and control your impulses. This is the part of you that rehearsed that presentation, that prepared for that interview, that carefully considered what you would say in that difficult conversation. This is your conscious, intelligent, capable self, the version of you that you identify with when you think about who you are. But deep in the center of this city, buried far beneath the modern developments and sophisticated infrastructure, there's an ancient district that's been there since the beginning. This is the limbic system, and at its core sits a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. And this structure has one job and one job only: to keep you alive by detecting threats and triggering your survival response. Now, Under normal circumstances, these two districts work together beautifully. Your prefrontal cortex handles the complex thinking, while your amygdala quietly monitors the environment for danger, and everything runs smoothly. But the moment your amygdala perceives a threat, everything changes. It doesn't send a polite memo to your prefrontal cortex asking for a discussion about the best course of action. It doesn't wait for conscious deliberation or rational analysis. Instead, it hits the emergency alarm and floods your entire system with stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, designed to prepare your body for immediate physical action. And here's where the sabotage begins, because when these stress hormones surge through your system, they don't just affect your body. They fundamentally alter the way your brain processes information. Blood flow and resources get redirected away from your prefrontal cortex, that sophisticated front district where all your higher thinking happens, and get rerouted to the more primitive survival centers. Your amygdala essentially shuts down the thinking part of your brain because in a genuine life or death situation, stopping to think gets you killed. You don't need to analyze your options when a tiger is charging at you. You need to run, fight, or freeze, and you need to do it right now. This system worked perfectly when your ancestors lived in environments where threats were immediate, physical, and obvious. If something triggered their amygdala, it was probably because there actually was a predator nearby, and shutting down higher thinking in favor of instant physical action was the right move. But here's the catastrophic problem. Your amygdala cannot tell the difference between a physical threat to your survival and a social or psychological threat to your ego. It responds to the possibility of embarrassment, rejection, failure, or judgment with the exact same emergency protocol it would use for a life-threatening attack. When you stand up to give that presentation and you see all those eyes on you, when you walk into that interview and feel the weight of expectation, when you approach that difficult conversation knowing that what you say could change everything, your amygdala interprets these situations as dangers. And so it does what it was designed to do. It triggers your threat response, floods your system with stress hormones, and shuts down the very parts of your brain you need most in those moments. And now you're standing there, trying to access your carefully prepared thoughts, trying to speak clearly and confidently, trying to make intelligent decisions. But the control center has been taken offline. Your working memory, which allows you to hold and manipulate information in your conscious awareness, becomes severely impaired. This is why you suddenly can't remember the opening line of your speech, why you draw a blank on information you knew perfectly well 5 minutes ago, why you can't seem to string together a coherent sentence even though you've been speaking fluent language your entire life. Your ability to think flexibly and creatively gets shut down as your brain shifts into rigid, black and white thinking patterns. Your perception narrows, a phenomenon called perceptual tunneling, where your attention becomes fixated on threat-related information while filtering out everything else. You become hyper-aware of every facial expression, every subtle cue that might indicate disapproval or judgment. And these threat signals get amplified in your perception, while any positive or neutral information gets ignored. But the sabotage goes even deeper than this, because your brain isn't just shutting down your higher functions. It's actively generating thoughts and interpretations designed to reinforce the threat response. Your mind starts producing a running commentary of catastrophic predictions and harsh self-judgments. You hear that voice inside your head telling you that everyone can see you're failing, that you're about to humiliate yourself, that you're not good enough for this moment, that everything is falling apart. And these aren't just random negative thoughts. They're part of the threat response system, designed to make you hyper-vigilant and cautious. In a genuine survival situation, this kind of vigilant, self-critical thinking might help you avoid dangerous mistakes. But in a high-pressure social or professional situation, these thoughts become a self-fulfilling prophecy. They increase your anxiety, which increases your stress hormones, which further impairs your cognitive functioning, which generates more anxious thoughts, creating a vicious cycle that spirals rapidly out of control. And here's perhaps the most insidious part of this whole process. The more you care about the outcome, the more likely your mind is to sabotage you. When something doesn't matter much, when the stakes are low, your amygdala stays calm and your prefrontal cortex remains online, allowing you to perform at your best. But the moment something becomes truly important to you, the moment you genuinely care about succeeding, that importance itself becomes a threat signal. Your brain interprets the high stakes as danger, because failure in this important moment could lead to rejection, loss of status, damage to your self-image, all things that your ancient survival system treats as threats to your well-being. So the very fact that you care so much about doing well becomes the trigger for the biological response that makes it nearly impossible to do well. It's a cruel paradox. The things that matter most to you are precisely the things you're most likely to sabotage. Now, if you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in these patterns, you might be feeling a sense of despair, thinking that if this response is so deeply wired into your biology, if it's such an ancient and automatic system, then maybe there's nothing you can do about it. Maybe you're just destined to choke in important moments, to watch your mind betray you whenever the pressure rises. But that's not true. Understanding this mechanism isn't meant to make you feel hopeless. It's meant to give you the clarity you need to finally address what's actually happening instead of fighting shadows. Because once you understand that this isn't about your character, that it's not evidence that you're weak or incapable, once you see that this is a biological response system that can be recognized and managed, everything changes. The problem isn't that you can't handle pressure. The problem is that your threat detection system has learned to categorize certain high-pressure situations as dangerous, and it's trying to protect you in the only way it knows how, even though its protection is actually sabotaging you. So, how do you break this cycle? How do you reclaim control over your own mind in the moments that matter most? The answer isn't what most people think. It's not about trying harder, being more confident, or forcing yourself to just push through the anxiety. All of those approaches treat the symptoms while ignoring the underlying cause. And often they make things worse by adding another layer of pressure and self-judgment on top of an already overwhelmed system. The real solution begins with something that might sound counterintuitive. You have to stop treating these moments as threats. You have to teach your amygdala, that ancient threat detector, that these high-pressure situations are not dangerous, that they're challenges to engage with rather than dangers to escape from. And you can't do this through logic or rational thinking, because your amygdala doesn't speak the language of logic. It speaks the language of experience and pattern recognition. It learns through repeated exposure and emotional reframing. This is where most people's approach to handling pressure goes wrong. They try to talk themselves out of their anxiety with rational arguments. They tell themselves there's nothing to be afraid of, that it's just a presentation or just an interview, that the worst thing that can happen isn't that bad. But while they're having this rational conversation with themselves, their amygdala isn't listening. It's not convinced by logic. It's only convinced by experience, by what actually happens in these situations. And suppose your pattern has been to experience these moments as threatening, to have your body respond with anxiety and stress, to have the experience confirm that these situations are uncomfortable and difficult. In that case, that's what your amygdala has learned. That's the pattern it expects and prepares for. So every time you enter a high-pressure situation, your amygdala is already primed to trigger the threat response, because that's what the data says should happen. Breaking this pattern requires you to create new data, new experiences that teach your amygdala a different story. And this starts with a fundamental shift in how you relate to the physical sensations of pressure. When you feel your heart start to race before an important moment, when you feel that tightness in your chest, that tension in your muscles, that flutter of anxiety in your stomach, your immediate instinct is probably to interpret these sensations as signs that something is wrong, as evidence that you're not ready, that you're losing control. But these physical sensations aren't signs of impending failure. They are signs that your body is mobilizing energy, preparing you for action. The same physiological response that happens when you're anxious, the increased heart rate, the heightened alertness, the surge of adrenaline, is almost identical to the physiological response that happens when you're excited, energized, and ready to perform. The difference isn't in the physical sensations themselves. The difference is in how you interpret them. There's groundbreaking research from Harvard psychologist Alison Wood Brooks that demonstrates this principle with stunning clarity. She took people who were about to give public speeches, people whose bodies were already flooded with stress hormones, whose hearts were racing, whose hands were trembling, and she divided them into 3 groups. The first group was told to try to calm down, to tell themselves, "I am calm," before giving their speech. This is what most of us instinctively do when we feel anxious. We try to suppress the arousal, to push down the physical sensations, to force ourselves into a state of calm. The second group was given no instructions at all. They just went up and gave their speeches with whatever anxiety they were feeling. But the third group was given a different instruction, one that seemed almost counterintuitive. They were told to reframe their anxiety as excitement, to tell themselves, "I'm excited," before giving their speech. Just that simple reframe, just changing the label they put on their physical arousal from anxiety to excitement. The results were remarkable. The people who tried to calm themselves down performed the worst. They gave speeches that were rated as less competent, less persuasive, less confident than the other groups. The people who received no instructions performed moderately. But the people who reframed their anxiety as excitement, who embraced their arousal instead of fighting it, performed significantly better. They gave speeches that were rated as more compelling, more confident, more effective. And here's what's crucial to understand. The physiological state of all 3 groups was essentially identical. They all had racing hearts. They all had adrenaline coursing through their systems. They all had the same bodily arousal. The only difference was the interpretation, the meaning they assigned to those sensations. The people who labeled it as excitement instead of anxiety were able to channel that energy into performance instead of having it sabotage them. This isn't just positive thinking or mind over matter nonsense. This is about understanding that your physical arousal in high-pressure moments is neutral. It's energy. It's preparation. It's your body mobilizing resources. And whether that energy helps you or hurts, you depends almost entirely on the story you tell yourself about what it means. When you interpret those sensations as anxiety, as signs that something is wrong, your brain hears that interpretation as confirmation of threat. It doubles down on the stress response, redirects even more resources away from your prefrontal cortex, generates even more catastrophic thoughts. But when you interpret those same sensations as excitement, as signs that you're ready and engaged, your brain processes that interpretation differently. The arousal doesn't disappear, but it gets channeled into focused energy rather than debilitating anxiety. You're not trying to suppress or eliminate your body's natural response to pressure. You're changing your relationship with it. And this is where most people's strategy for handling pressure needs a complete overhaul. They spend enormous amounts of energy trying to not feel anxious, trying to eliminate the physical symptoms of stress, trying to achieve some mythical state of perfect calm before important moments. But that's fighting against millions of years of evolution. Your body is designed to respond to significant situations with arousal. That's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. The problem isn't the arousal itself. The problem is when your mind misinterprets that arousal as evidence of danger, and triggers a full-scale threat response. So instead of trying to eliminate the physical sensations, instead of fighting against your own biology, you need to learn to welcome those sensations, to recognize them as preparation, as your body getting ready to perform, not as signs that you're falling apart. This requires practice, and it requires you to start small. You can't wait until the biggest moment of your life to try this strategy. You need to train your system gradually, exposing yourself to progressively higher levels of pressure, while consistently reframing your arousal as excitement and preparation, rather than anxiety and threat. This is how you create new data for your amygdala. New experiences that teach it that these situations are manageable, that arousal doesn't mean danger, that you can perform well even when your heart is racing and your palms are sweating. You start with situations that feel moderately challenging but not overwhelming. Maybe it's speaking up in a meeting where you usually stay quiet, or initiating a difficult conversation you've been avoiding, or volunteering to present something to a small group. Whatever it is, you deliberately put yourself in a situation that triggers some arousal. And then you practice interpreting that arousal as excitement, as preparation, as energy, while you follow through with the action done. And here's what happens when you do this repeatedly. Your amygdala starts to learn a new pattern. Instead of associating arousal in these contexts with danger, it begins to associate it with successful performance. The pattern gets rewritten. The neural pathways that automatically triggered the full threat response start to weaken, while new pathways form that allow you to maintain access to your prefrontal cortex, even when your body is in a state of high arousal. This doesn't happen overnight. This isn't about trying this strategy once and expecting miraculous results. This is about consistent exposure, about repeatedly proving to your threat detection system through direct experience that these situations are not dangerous, that you can handle them. That arousal in these contexts predicts success rather than disaster. But there's another layer to this that we need to address, because reframing your arousal is only part of the solution. The other critical piece involves what you focus your attention on during high-pressure moments. Remember that perceptual tunneling we talked about earlier, where your attention becomes fixated on threat-related information? When you're in the grip of a threat response, your brain is scanning the environment for signs of danger, for evidence that confirms your anxiety is justified. And it will find what it's looking for. If you're giving a presentation and you're in a state of anxiety, your attention will lock onto the person in the third row who looks bored, or the person in the back checking their phone, or any tiny facial expression that might indicate disapproval or judgment. Your brain will amplify these signals while filtering out all the positive or neutral signals, all the people who are engaged and interested, all the cues that you're actually doing fine. This attentional bias creates a self-fulfilling prophecy because what you focus on affects how you perform. If your attention is locked on signs of disapproval, if you're hypervigilant to any hint of negative evaluation, that focus itself degrades your performance. It pulls your cognitive resources away from the task at hand. It increases your self-consciousness and anxiety. It makes you more likely to stumble, to lose your train of thought, to appear nervous and uncertain. And then your poor performance generates actual negative reactions from your audience, which your threat detection system picks up on, which increases your anxiety further, which degrades your performance even more. It's another vicious cycle, another way your mind sabotages you by focusing on the very things that make sabotage more likely. Breaking this cycle requires deliberate attention management. You need to train yourself to consciously direct your focus toward task-relevant information rather than threat-relevant information. When you're in a high-pressure situation, instead of scanning for signs of disapproval or judgment, instead of monitoring your own anxiety symptoms, you deliberately focus your attention on the task itself. If you're giving a presentation, You focus on the content you're delivering, on the points you want to make, on connecting with the people who are engaged. If you're in an interview, you focus on understanding the questions being asked and providing thoughtful answers, not on analyzing every subtle change in the interviewer's expression. If you're having a difficult conversation, you focus on listening to what the other person is saying and expressing yourself clearly, not on catastrophizing about all the ways this could go wrong. This is harder than it sounds because your threat detection system will keep trying to pull your attention back to threat monitoring. It will keep generating intrusive thoughts about how you're being perceived, how you're performing, whether people are judging you. But every time you notice this happening, every time you catch yourself scanning for danger signals or spiraling into anxious thoughts, you gently but firmly redirect your attention back to the task. You don't fight with these thoughts or try to suppress them. You acknowledge them briefly, like noticing a car alarm going off in the distance, and then you return your focus to what you're doing. This is a skill, and like any skill, it improves with practice. The more you practice redirecting your attention from threat monitoring to task focus, the more automatic it becomes. The easier it gets to maintain that focus, even under pressure. And there's one more crucial element we need to discuss, perhaps the most important one, and it's about the narrative you carry about yourself in relation to pressure. Deep in your unconscious mind, you have beliefs about who you are in high-stakes situations, beliefs that were formed through past experiences and that now shape how you approach every new high-pressure moment. If your history has been one of repeatedly choking under pressure, of watching yourself fail when things matter most, then you've likely developed a narrative that says, "I'm someone who falls apart when it counts." This narrative isn't just a neutral observation about your past. It's a prediction about your future, and predictions have a powerful way of fulfilling themselves. When you walk into a high-pressure situation, carrying the belief that you're someone who chokes, that belief primes your entire system for exactly that outcome. Your amygdala, already sensitive to these situations, gets an extra signal that says, "This is dangerous for us specifically, because we're not good at this." And so it triggers the threat response even more readily, even more intensely. Changing this narrative requires you to fundamentally rewrite your identity in relation to pressure. And that rewriting happens through accumulated evidence, through experiences that contradict the old story. This is why the progressive exposure approach is so critical. Every time you put yourself in a challenging situation and manage to perform adequately, even if not perfectly, you're creating evidence for a new narrative. You're proving to yourself that you can handle pressure, that you don't always fall apart, that you're capable of maintaining your composure and accessing your abilities even when the stakes are high. And over time, with enough contradictory evidence, the old narrative begins to lose its grip. A new story starts to form, one that says, "I'm someone who can rise to challenges, who can perform under pressure, who gets stronger when things matter." But here's the thing about building this new narrative. You have to be willing to tolerate imperfect performances along the way. You have to be willing to put yourself in situations where you might not perform at your absolute best, where you might stumble or make mistakes, because the goal isn't perfection. The goal is to prove to your threat detection system that these situations are survivable, that imperfect performances don't destroy you, that you can handle whatever happens. If you wait until you feel completely ready, if you only put yourself in high-pressure situations when you're confident you'll perform perfectly, you'll never break the cycle because you'll never accumulate the evidence you need. You'll keep avoiding and postponing, and every time you avoid a challenging situation, you reinforce the narrative that these situations are dangerous, that you can't handle them, that you need to be protected from them. I want you to think about the most successful performers in any field. The athletes who thrive in championship moments, the speakers who come alive in front of large audiences, the leaders who make their best decisions under extreme pressure. These people aren't free from the physiological responses we've been discussing. Their hearts still race, their adrenaline still spikes, their bodies still mobilize energy in high-stakes situations. But they've trained themselves to interpret these sensations differently, to channel that energy effectively, and they've built up a wealth of experiences that taught their threat detection systems that pressure situations are opportunities rather than dangers. They've rewritten their narratives through repeated exposure and successful navigation of challenges. And perhaps most importantly, they've learned to separate their identity from individual performances. They know that one bad moment doesn't define them, that mistakes and imperfections are part of the process, that failure in a specific situation doesn't make them a failure as a person. This last point is crucial because one of the reasons high-pressure moments trigger such intense threat responses is that we've made them mean too much about who we are. We've collapsed the distinction between "I performed poorly in this situation" and "I am inadequate as a person." We've fused our sense of self-worth with our performance outcomes in a way that makes every high-stakes situation feel like an existential threat. And your amygdala responds to existential threats with maximum force. So part of breaking the sabotage cycle is learning to uncouple your identity from your performance, to recognize that how you do in any given moment is just data about that moment, not a verdict on your fundamental worth or capability as a human being. This doesn't mean you stop caring about outcomes. It means you stop treating outcomes as judgments of your essential value. When you can approach high-pressure situations with this mindset, when you can interpret your arousal as preparation rather than danger, when you can maintain task-focused attention instead of threat-monitoring attention, when you carry a narrative of capability rather than inadequacy, and when you've decoupled your self-worth from your performance, something remarkable happens. The situations that used to trigger overwhelming threat responses start to feel different. They don't become easy or stress-free, but they become manageable. Your mind stops sabotaging you because it's no longer perceiving these moments as life-threatening dangers that require emergency shutdown procedures. Instead, it recognizes them as challenges that require focus, energy, and access to your full capabilities. And it allows you to bring those capabilities online instead of shutting them down. This transformation doesn't happen through a single insight or decision. It happens through consistent practice, through repeatedly putting yourself in progressively challenging situations while implementing these strategies, through accumulating experiences that gradually retrain your threat detection system. It requires patience because you're working against patterns that have been reinforced over years, maybe decades. It requires self-compassion because you will still have moments where you don't perform as well as you'd like, where the old patterns reassert themselves, where you feel like you're back at square one. But if you persist, if you keep practicing these approaches, if you keep creating new experiences and new evidence, the patterns will shift. Your relationship with pressure will transform, and the mind that once sabotaged you in your most important moments will become the ally it was always capable of being. The ultimate irony in all of this is that the sabotage was never malicious. Your mind wasn't betraying you out of cruelty or weakness. It was trying to protect you in the only way it knew how, using an ancient survival system that was designed for a different kind of threat in a different kind of world. The sabotage happened because your brain couldn't distinguish between a predator that could kill you and an audience that could judge you, between a physical danger that required immediate escape and a social challenge that required thoughtful engagement. Once you understand this, once you see that the sabotage is a misapplied protection mechanism rather than evidence of your inadequacy, you can work with your mind instead of against it. You can teach it gradually and patiently that the situations you care most about aren't the situations you need to be protected from. They're the situations where you most need access to your full capabilities, your clear thinking, your authentic self. And when you finally reach that place, when you can stand in a high-pressure moment and feel your heart racing and recognize it as energy, when you can notice the threat-monitoring thoughts arise and gently redirect to task focus, when you can perform imperfectly and know that it doesn't diminish your worth, when you can look back at a history of growth instead of a history of choking, that's when everything changes. That's when the moments that used to break you start to make you. That's when pressure becomes a catalyst for your best work instead of a trigger for your worst fears. That's when you stop being sabotaged by your own mind and start being supported by it, even in the moments that matter most.